I'm Ruth Levine, the Director of the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation in beautiful Northern California. And of course, Washington is beautiful too. Today. And I have the pleasure of being able to moderate this discussion. The way it's going to work is we'll do one round of sort of, me asking questions of each of the panelists. They'll have 3 to 5 minutes or so to give a response, and I encourage them to, in that, sort of wrap in any of their own biographical details they would like. I'm going to do very simple introductions. And then I'll invite them to maybe ask, a couple of them to ask each other questions, because I know when I'm on a panel, I sit there wanting to be part of the audience and ask questions. So you'll have the chance to do that and have some quick responses. Then we're going to open it up to what I am thinking is going to be a pretty fast-paced question and answer with selected questions from the audience, which I believe also includes however many people are tuned into the live stream. And then we'll have a few closing remarks. And I think after that, our friends from IEG are going to make a brief announcement that is relevant to lunch and a later activity. I think that's how it goes, right, David? Yes. Is that right? Yes. Okay. Got my instructions right. So with no further ado, let me start. I'll introduce folks in turn. But Jonathan Fox, let me start with you. So Jonathan is in the ivory tower, right, at American University? No. Well, y'all have to prove otherwise. At the Accountability Research Center, and has for a long time been one of the leading thinkers about citizen engagement, transparency, accountability efforts, and really has established some of the frameworks that have been most influential in the field. When you go to a transparency and accountability meeting, if Fox were part of a drinking game, we would all be quite inebriated at the end. So Jonathan, you have worked on the evidence side of things. You've seen a lot of groups doing, civil society organizations doing work to engage citizens. Can you reflect for a few minutes about what is the connect or disconnect between the evidence that's been generated about what works and what citizen groups are really doing?
Sure. Thanks, Ruth, and thanks to the conveners for the invitation. And one of the puzzles in our field is what do we do with the mixed results that comes from the body of evidence? And I have two responses, and this is informed by quite intensive dialogue with the kind of practitioner that I call action strategists. In other words, not mere implementers, but those who are the change agents. And the two broad responses, I think it's time to rethink the theories of change that get studied, and then we need to also rethink how we interpret the evidence, and we need to unpack the evidence in order to inform practice, as opposed to treating it as a kind of maybe a homogeneous black box. So I have three broad propositions that I think may provoke some debate. And I think there are three challenges posed by this issue. One is low dose, the other is fuzzy proxies, and the third is crowding out. By low dose, I mean that there's a large part of the now vast evidence base over the last 15 years focuses on testing tool-led interventions, what I've called tactical approaches. And strategic approaches are much less studied. Strategic approaches imply the simultaneous deployment of multiple tactics. A lot of the evaluations are of interventions that are light touch, information-led, hyper-localized, and have uncertain sustainability. And they're based on the implicit assumption, particularly in the social accountability field, that the main problems are in the local arena, and therefore we can solve with local initiatives as opposed to taking a more systemic approach. The second challenge in terms of how what can practitioners learn from the evidence base is the challenge of fuzzy proxies. And here the question is, do the indicators really indicate what they're supposed to indicate? And for this, one often needs to go not only to the annexes, but to the online annexes that aren't even in the article. And there one needs to look very carefully to unpack how is participation or voice operationalized? How is bottom-up accountability operationalized? Is putting up a poster outside the clinic about what people's rights are supposed to be, is that really community monitoring? How do we really measure bottom-up accountability, particularly when some studies conflate an attempt to generate bottom-up accountability that doesn't succeed and then nothing happens, versus actually generating bottom-up accountability and then it doesn't have the desired effect. Those are two very different things that often get morphed under the same umbrella. So that's what I mean by, attendance at meetings is not exactly a great indicator of answerability. And there's some studies that do a very good job of operationalizing this, and we're going to hear a bit from Results for Development about the very careful work they've done on participation. But I think we need to distinguish between the apples and oranges inside the evidence box. And then in terms of the third point I want to make is about crowding out. I think this dominance of tool-led interventions in the body of evidence, I would argue, is that it's had a crowding out effect in terms of how much energy is dedicated to evaluating other theories of change. There are other theories of change other than handing out leaflets with the audit results so we can think, for example, of multi-level approaches that try to monitor the entire supply chain of service delivery, as in the case of textbook count in the Philippines. We can think of sandwich strategies that try to that don't accept the deductive proposition that it's either bottom-up or top-down, and are instead based on the proposition that they can be mutually reinforcing, as in the case of, for example, in Puno, Peru, a long-standing initiative of Foro Salud, and supported by CARE, where the regional ombuds agency literally legitimated and validated the role of grassroots indigenous women's monitoring of the functioning of clinics, giving them some degree of protection. They really reduce the inherent risk in speaking out, and that's an issue that picks up on something that Lily mentioned. Where's the fear factor in all of this? And if change initiatives don't take the fear factor into account from the beginning, they're going to be inherently constrained. Other strategies include, we're going to hear from Warren about some of the IBP's work, which is moving in the direction of a constituency-led approach, as opposed to a tool-led approach. So there are community paralegal strategies, like in the Namati network. Other approaches include intensive leadership training, as in the case of PECA, the Women-Head Families Empowerment in Indonesia, which involves more than 20,000 widows and other single women who, some of whom go through intensive training to pursue gender rights in the context of village governance. These are not just information-led. They're not light touch. They're based on an actor-led approach as opposed to a tool-led approach. So that's it.
Thank you so much. So from what I've heard from you, we are possibly studying the wrong things, maybe using the wrong measurements.
I'm not saying wrong. I'm just saying there's a lopsided effort that crowds out a multiplicity of possible strategies that are being carried out by the people doing the work on the front line, the people who are taking the risks.
Great. Okay. Great. Then let's try to, as we go through this conversation, kind of open the aperture as you're suggesting. Jean, can I turn to you next? So Jean Arkedis is the Senior Program Manager at Results for Development. Did I get your title right? No?
Very close.
What is
Senior
it?
Director of Evaluation and Adaptive Learning.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I'm glad you introduced yourself then, and obviously leads on the evaluation and learning activities at Results for Development, and has had a lot of experience evaluating transparency and accountability, citizen engagement initiatives. Do you want to pick up on what Jonathan said and make any additional comments?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So my sort of foray into this field of citizen engagement began in sort of 2011, 2012 through the program that Ruth referred to, Transparency for Development program, R4D had been working in citizen engagement for some time before that, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around that time despite some of the mixed evidence that you had mentioned, Jonathan, for the promise of citizen engagement, particularly in the health arena, as the sort of short route option to correct for accountability failures that were happening elsewhere in service delivery and health. And so T4D came into this space trying to answer this question of, could a citizen-led intervention actually improve health? And could we design, evaluate, and adapt a set of interventions in multiple contexts to look at that question? And fast forward to where we are today, having spent sort of 6 years through this program trying to work with partners to iteratively design and then running a mixed method evaluation. I think I'm very chastened about how difficult it is to do this work, to do it well. I gather from the earlier panel this morning, this theme of we have a lot of bricks, but we need to be focusing on building houses really resonates with me. Through the course of our work, we just face so many different discrete design choices in a complex adaptive environment and had very little to go on in terms of either theory or evidence base to inform those design choices in new sets of contexts. And so I think it leads me to this question of really what should our evidence generation strategies look like in the future if we want to build new houses, and what do those houses look like? And I think there's actually probably two different kinds of houses, right? So one is kind of a knowledge building house, which asks generalizable and important questions that are fundamental and takes a more kind of basic research, academic type approach. Answering questions around what does it take to get citizens to participate, under what conditions, in what context, and how can you make that participation effective, or other general questions. Separately, I think you find a lot of organizations, we tried to select them and work with them through T4D, who are these sort of action strategists. But often the kind of support that they are given to get feedback on their theories of change, to explore what might look like in their context, is very limited or projectized. And so, what I would like to see would be houses built around sort of selecting in conditions where you think there actually is promise for citizen engagement, a more robust kind of evidence generation and adaptive learning strategy that helps support those who are doing work in specific contexts to advance their aims. Because I think there's sort of an emerging paradigm shift, in the evidence generation field in general, sort of away from RCTs as only impact evaluations, because we see that, these are complex, long causal chain programs. And so if we want is more local ownership, if what we want is more iteration, then we have to support that process with funding and more patient kind of research and evidence generation packages of support.
Great, that's really helpful. I'm wondering if you could just, as a little bit of a follow-up, put a little bit of meat on the bones when you talk about the design choices that you were working with partners to make and had little theory to go on. Can you just give an example?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our case, we were trying to improve maternal and newborn health within communities, where we were based off the very celebrated Bjorkman and Svensson work in Uganda, which had a sort of intervention that had proven successful in that context, to mobilize groups of citizens in local communities to solve problems that would result in improved performance at the clinic level. And even who to select as the citizens to participate, and do you take an elite strategy? Do you take a broad-based strategy that's more representative? What that facilitation process might look like? Should the sort of how hands-on should you be and constraining sort of the choices of what kinds of actions they might choose to work on? Do you sort of seed their discussions with ideas about what are the effective strategies in health or in education where other people have tried this? Or is local ownership more important? And should you therefore leave open what citizens choose to do. I mean, just so many decisions need to be made to actually build a program.
Great, really helpful to hear that. Warren, let me turn to you. Warren Krafchick is the director of the International Budget Partnership, which promotes fiscal transparency and all the good things that can, in theory, that might result from that. And Warren is one of the most thoughtful leaders in this field, always kind of questioning and searching for the next way to be more effective. So Warren, could you talk a little bit about the work that IBP has done around citizen engagement, some of the lessons you've learned, maybe how you've used some evaluation findings, if at all, to evolve your work and what your current thinking is?
Thank you. Right, in 3 minutes. So thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ruth. So I work for the International Budget Partnership. This is an organization that's been around for 20 years. And we work towards a world where public budgets are more transparent, they're more inclusive, and more accountable to the needs of poor and marginalized communities. We work on budgets, just to say this, because budgets are an incredibly powerful mechanism. They're the place where development and democracy meet. And so a dollar invested, or a rand, or a pound invested in the budget really gets you at those two outcomes, and helps you to test both of those two outcomes at the same time. Now, historically, our core work has been about helping to build the capability of civic organizations to participate meaningfully in public budget processes. We provide training and technical assistance, financial assistance, peer engagement, comparative learning, etc. And this is a wide variety of institutions and partners that we work with in about 100 countries. They look very different in many ways. But what they have in common is they all specialize in producing timely, credible, useful information on the impact of the budget on poor and marginalized communities. The type of information analyses that you don't typically see when public budgets are released. We do some other work at the international level, but I'm going to leave that for the moment. Over the past 10 years or so, we've begun to document some impacts that are emerging from the work of our partners. And I want to talk through 4 lessons that are coming out of that work. But first, let me admit that when I talk about documenting, I'm talking about a process that we started 10 years ago, which uses external researchers, but chooses successful cases and documents them retrospectively. So let me put that out there. So let me put those limitations out there. So what do the cases look like? So we work with an organization called DASIG in Argentina. They work with local audit authorities to make sure that the government implements the right to education for young children. So all young children get access to early childhood development. We work with an organization in Brazil called INESC that worked with a powerful coalition of indigenous groups and parliamentarians to stop a very regressive tax bill from being introduced. We work with an organization called the Treatment Act Campaign in South Africa. It's a social movement. It helped work with parliamentarians, with communities, to convince the Supreme Court to compel the government to spend money to purchase antiretrovirals for those with HIV. So more than 2.5 million South Africans now have access to antiretrovirals. So those are the kinds of impact that we try and document. Now, with the limitations of the method taken into account, there are a couple of factors, 4 factors, which tend to come up consistently in the success cases that we look at. The first factor is our successful cases never start with the demand for transparency or the demand for participation. They start with a constituency, as Jonathan's saying, or a demand for development. They start up with someone or a group waking up and saying, I need a roof over my head. My child needs to go to school. Those are where success seems to drive. Cases that we support that start with transparency get exactly that, transparency. They don't go further. Second point is the organizations that we work with tend to provide a really important contribution to both the state and to civil society. They're producing the kind of information that's unlikely or hasn't traditionally come out of the budget process. The budget process is top-down. It's dominated by the executive, usually dominated by clique in the executive. This is providing a way to democratize that debate. These institutions are important, and I think we can show that it works in low-income and and middle-income countries. It works as think tanks, and it works as social movements. But these factors, access to information, access to skills, are seldom, if ever, sufficient to drive social change. It seems that we need two other political economy factors. The first one is about coalition building. The cases that we find that are successful are where our partners are deeply nested in civil society. They're not going it alone. They're not only relying on an elite advocacy. Sometimes that works, but sometimes that can be as easily reversed. They're thinking strategically about what kind of organizing and coalitions to build. And more often than not, or increasingly often, they're about direct relationships between those organizations and poor and vulnerable communities. I think that's important going into the kind of governance environment that we're working in at the moment. And then the final factor is each of these coalitions, these partnerships, include partnerships with the state. Oversight actors in particular, legislators are important in the budgets. They're keepers of the purse. Supreme audit institutions, ombudspeople, the judiciary, as well as champions in government. So we started off this work focusing intensely on supporting a particular kind of civic organization. What we're finding is that's important. But what's even more important is the kind of context, the accountability ecosystem that they fit into. And what we need to understand much more, and I'm looking to people like those around the room to help us understand, is what do those institutions in the accountability system look like? What are the tools and tactics that work in that system, and how do they interact? So that what kinds of configurations work in what kinds of contexts to make it more likely that we're going to get to accountability.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, and really sort of ties together, I think, some of the points that both Jonathan and Jean made. Can you just say another word about accountability ecosystem? That's like a little too abstract for my brain to handle. Can you just concretize that a little bit?
I'm trying to live up to the audience. By accountability ecosystem, there's a set of institutions that interact to produce budgets and budget decisions. And I'm talking about that set of institutions. So it would include the executive and the Department of Finance in particular, or Department of Taxation. But then includes on the oversight side a legislature, a supreme audit institution that checks what happens, evaluates what happens at the end of the year, a set of ombudspeople that sometimes one can refer to, a set of human rights commissions or other types of commissions that adjudicate the morality sometimes of the budget process. And then it includes a set of civic actors, civil society organizations, communities, networks, etc. And so I'm talking about an ecosystem that interacts around a policy-making process. And I'm interested in what the role of civic organizations in that process, but also what role the others organizations play. How do you get the right configurations to drive the right policies?
Great, very, very helpful. To me anyway, I hope to everybody else as well. Jeff Thindwa, you are the director of the the what? You wish. Oh, whoops. Okay, I'm getting everything wrong. The program manager for the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. I should read my notes. And we'll hope nobody heard that. So Jeff, you're involved in making some key decisions around how the Global Partnership for Social Accountability uses the resources that are entrusted to you for support of civil society organizations. Talk to us a little bit about how those decisions that you're making are influenced by best available evidence, how you support those organizations, and reflect on anything anybody else has said as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Ruth, and thanks to 3IE and our IEG group, for this very timely conversation. Very quickly on the GPSA. The GPSA enables civil society to work or collaborate with governments to tackle governance problems, especially in the service delivery area. We have specifically, we see our role as connecting civil society with governments, and through the social accountability work of the CSOs. 53 governments have joined the GPSA. We have some 41 projects in 27 or so countries, providing grants of between $500,000 and $800,000 over 3 to 5 years for social accountability in health, education, social protection, and water, fragility, conflict, and violence, and all of that. Importantly, we accompany these grants with implementation and capacity building support, along with M&D and knowledge and learning and partnerships. So to your question, how we use evidence to inform our decisions on supporting CSOs, when we opened our first call for proposals in 2013, there was quite a number of syntheses, evidence synthesis at that time. And one of the things that really stood out, which you already heard from Jonathan and from Warren, is this notion that social accountability is more than just about the role of information. It is information plus. And that plus is extremely important in a field where evaluations have generally focused on the role of information. So it means really that we have to get beyond issues of transparency and information. We build this insight into our grant making from start, and it means that our funding looks into the breadth of interactions within civil society and between civil society and public institutions throughout the public management cycle. So the key insight from this thinking is it comes out of our reflections with our teams and with our partners, and also the first set of evaluations that came from our work. Second, I'll start with an example to raise my next point, which is that our decisions to support CSOs must pay attention to whether and how they can help connect civil society with governments to find their own synergies. And again, with our internal reviews and analysis, reflections with the teams and with our partners, we came to the view that this is the comparative advantage of our program. So Globe International, who is our partner in Mongolia, used social accountability to involve head-up parents in decisions affecting their children's schools. And as a result of that, we have parents and teachers participating in 20 schools now and collaborating through parent-teacher associations. And the PTAs themselves have received skills. They have learned to engage local authorities, local education authorities, on improving the quality of education of their children using a community scorecard and other types of activities that focus on strengthening capacities, building trust, building community, and so on. And the principals and authorities have started to see the PTAs in these schools as allies. So the insight from this, which continues to inform our evolving theory of action, is that our CSS support decision can either help or hinder that connection of citizens and civil society and public institutions so that they find their own synergies. Third, we've learned that our funding decisions must have an eye on paths to institutionalization and scaling in order to make our meager resources work harder and go further. Insights from the midterm evaluation of the Mongolia Globe International project I've mentioned helped government officials to see that social accountability could help them solve some of the problems that are prevailing in the school-based management reform, such as suboptimal engagement of parents and teachers. So working with our World Bank sector colleagues, we brokered a conversation between government and CSO partners, and this led to the adoption by a World Bank-funded education quality reform project, adopting the PTA mechanism or PTA feature of the civil society social accountability program and integrated in that education reform operation that was being supported by the bank. And so coming out of that, the Ministry of Education has now committed to awarding grants to the 28 PTAs to help them strengthen their capacity and improve performance. I should stress here that our location in the World Bank, which we like to say has its pluses and minuses, but mostly on aggregate, the pluses helped us tremendously to play this brokerage role, because it's the education sector specialist in Mongolia who was instrumental in bridging social accountability of civil society with the education authorities. Fourth, we've learned from real experiences the importance of flexible funding. Again, this case of Globe International, it wasn't in their original plans or even their business model to bridge social accountability with an education reform operation. But the midterm evaluation of the project that we conducted, even if it pointed to the merits of that bridging, wasn't the one that did it. It was the availability of flexible funding that the CSOs took advantage of and shifted some resources from some budget lines to strengthen their collaboration with government and to make that bridging work, leading to much stronger synergies. So the evidence from Mongolia does, in our view, support the efficacy of flexible funding, which creates the space for risk-taking by the CSOs to do things that they might otherwise be afraid of doing. And we all know that often CSOs are afraid of changing plans because the evaluator might give them a bad grade. Fifth and finally, our grant-making decisions are informed by the reality of our resource envelopes, but also by the assessed negative risk of pent-up frustrations from CSOs whose expectations we cannot fulfill. And it also is informed by the potential for leveraging complementary resources at the country level. So what we've done now is, in the next call for proposal for the GPSA, we've added a criterion on co-financing. I know this is generating a lot of conversation, but we have to ask, given the limited pool of funds that we have, shouldn't we work harder to leverage alternative and complementary resources from country-level development partners who will enlarge the envelope for the GPSA? So to sum up, monitoring and evaluation can and has informed our CSO support decision-making. However, we're still learning by doing, and we're adapting at a fairly fast pace when it comes to especially the embedding of civil society in public sector and governance reforms. And as those processes and the ensuing lessons evolve and grow, we are trusting that they will continue to inform the decision-making for supporting CSOs of the likes of the GPSA and other partners.
Great, thanks very much. So as I was listening to your example, it reminded me a little bit of Lily's sort of archetypical, like the government wants to fill the potholes, the citizens say, here are the potholes, and it's a synergistic or complementary kind of relationship. Is that sort of the norm of what you're looking for in the GPSA? And do bank staff who are working with government sort of suggest to governments that this is a way for them to meet their own goals?
We think that we think something fundamental has happened to the World Bank's business model. That previously, as you know, it was all about supporting and strengthening government systems. Sometimes we just call that supply-side governance, supply-side systems. But an understanding of governance as processes by which stakeholders of government come together to make government work. Not top-down authorities telling people what to do, but collaboratively various stakeholders figuring out what is going wrong and how can we bring our comparative skills and strengths to bear on fixing those problems. We think that that's the fundamental business model now of the institution. And so we don't see the solution to governance problems, to development challenges, outside a collaborative framework that draws together public institutions and citizens. And citizens here, there is the democratic aspect, obviously, which is rights-driven, but there's also citizens as agents of change, as agents of development, and the organizations, the CSOs, that they bring to the development table not just themselves as citizens, but their observations, their experiences, their assessments, their preferences, which the CSOs, of course, help to aggregate and to represent.
Great, thanks very much for that. So I promised that you would each get a chance to ask each other questions, if you have them, burning questions. Jean, you've been looking very thoughtful throughout this conversation. You have any questions for anybody?
Sure, maybe for Warren and Jonathan, I'm very curious, your description of, Warren, the cases where you saw broad-based coalitions and sounds like, strategic thinking around what to do around a set of discrete problems. I guess my question, and from where I sit, is I see sort of opportunities to take places where you see that happening and do more action research and learning to support those processes. And I guess from your vantage point, is that something that would actually help push the field forward? Because I think what we're all talking about is an interventionalist approach to this kind of work, right? And how do we, in the next case, make it work better, bringing either funding or other resources to solve problems? And so I'm sort of coming at it from that sort of, what is that package of support look like?
What I can do is, that was actually going to be my question to you.
We should talk more.
My question was going to be, how can you combine good, rigorous analysis of a context-specific opportunity in ways that allow for comparability between countries? But I'll tell you what we're doing is the next step to try and get there. And so we started a project which we're actually doing partly in collaboration with Jonathan Center, ARC. And it's called Spark. And what it does is, in each of 7 countries, it's looking at trying to use service delivery as the entry point to changes in budgets, rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And in each country, it's trying to forge a partnership or support a partnership between a specialist civil society organization and a broad-based campaign or coalition that already has traction. And it's looking to see which of those campaigns are facing a budget problem or a significant budget problem. So can we provide a set of tools and tactics which will help that campaign overcome the budget problem? And the new part of it for us is an action research partnership with Institute for Development Studies and with ARC. And what it looks like is, there are 4 factors. I was thinking about this morning. So the first one is that the researchers are independent. They work very closely with IBP, but the accountability line is to IDS. IDS pays them. The second point is that they're embedded in the teams that are doing the work. And they've got substantial days to sit there, be embedded, and witness what's going on. The third factor is because they're embedded and they're there every day, they have the capacity to absorb or extract real-time information on what's happening, what's working, and what's not working, and pass that on to us. So hopefully that creates a kind of a much more rapid feedback loop than we've previously been able to do. And the fourth piece is what holds it together, and the leap forward from us is coming up with consistent hypotheses across the countries. So we can allow the focus, the campaigns to shift, we can allow the tactics to shift, but we're looking at the same hypothesis around civic engagement, services, and budgets. So that's a little bit how our work has shifted from the previous examples, which were independent researchers, but essentially retrospective successful cases.
Great. Jonathan, do you want to add, since you're implicated in this? Microphone? Oh, sorry. Add.
Well, yeah, I think as Warren said, this is a, I think, a very, very important example of taking the next step with a constituency-led approaches, and where information is the means, a means to an end, not the end in itself, and it's used and generated and used in the context of a broader approach where people are acting based on felt needs.
Great. So folks have already started to submit questions. We'll go to those now, and please continue. There's an acronym coming up that I don't know. What's FCV? Thank you. Okay. So the first question that we'll sort of tackle, and I'd invite people to volunteer to tackle this, maybe Jeff starting with you, is how you respond to the kind of opportunity and maybe demand at the local level, subnational, maybe county in Kenya, maybe state or district in India. How do you respond to those opportunities and help local governments identify where there might be opportunities for civic engagement?
Well, thank you very much. GPSA grants are competitive. So in some ways, our hands are tied by the response to the competition. So we will say proposals are welcome from eligible civil society organizations to define how they would seek to address problems in the following areas. And so it generates those proposals, and they go through a whole vetting process. But there's a sense in which absolutely everything we do is local or has direct local ramifications. I just came back from Uganda last night, and I drove 5 hours from a district called Ntungamo, visited 2 schools there, which had been financed by the Global Partnership for Education, and the GPSA accompanied that resource with social accountability over 4 years in the form of contract monitoring. So the service contracts are given to firms, and the firms sometimes want to take shortcuts in executing those contracts, in building those schools and the infrastructure. And what the Africa Freedom of Information Center, IT Uganda, and the Uganda Contract Monitoring Coalition are doing is to follow the implementation of these contracts by the firms. Importantly, what this has done is to bring into alliance local education authorities and local district authorities, because the CSOs are suddenly allies. At a dinner that they set up for us on Friday night, when we were still there, a conversation happened between KIK Uganda, which is an anti-corruption coalition, and the deputy representative district commissioner, who is the president's deputy to the president's representative, and they were reminding each other, remember how when we first met, you didn't want me to talk about corruption, you didn't want me to talk about transparency, and he was laughing and saying, yes, because you guys are troublemakers. But they joked about that, and for me, I just watched that and thought, this is collaborative governance in display. You have got 2 people with the same vision, which is we want integrity in the performance of these contracts, but sometimes the CSOs are a nuisance, but having demonstrated results, the district authorities and education authorities really, really appreciate the contribution of CSOs. So importantly, though, those local interactions, local results feed into the public procurement and disposal of assets authority of Uganda to inform the decisions they make about how to improve the contracting process.
Great, thanks very much. And let me just prepare your mind for a question that's going to come later, a sort of constellation of questions from the audience about how these things can be scaled, what might be lost at scale, and so forth. So I'll come back to you on that. Jonathan, question to you, a super easy one. What's the biggest game changer you've seen?
I think we're very much on the defensive all over the world. It's very hard to find something called a game changer. We're hanging, this whole project, we're hanging on by our fingernails, and I think we need to be really careful to avoid, and I'm going to use a very sort of culturally biased, U.S.-specific phrase, we need to be really careful about drinking our own Kool-Aid. There's huge risks. So I'm gonna hold off on that. But if you don't mind, I want to take you up on your earlier invitation to ask one of the other panelists a question. I want to ask a question for Jeff about the World Bank's approach, including GPSA, but also including the broader citizen engagement framework. And we're going to hear later, I guess, about the IEG's study of the citizen engagement framework, which involves a commitment to include a menu of options for beneficiary feedback throughout the investment portfolio, projects with identifiable beneficiaries. And at ARC, we did a parallel assessment of the World Bank's commitments to citizen engagement and came to quite actually similar conclusions. There's a mix of thick and thin levels of commitment, at least at the design stage. And I want to ask Jeff, in this broader context, we see a lot of openings for citizen engagement, potential openings, but what can you tell us about what the World Bank is doing on the government side, and how would you describe the government's work on the broader accountability ecosystem, as Warren was saying, in terms of bolstering the state's capacity to respond to citizen voice? And I'm just going to put my cards on the table. One of the things that I've noticed is that if you look at the World Bank's portfolio and try to see what is the World Bank doing to support accountability institutions like Supreme Audit institutions or ombuds agencies or human rights commissions. I've asked colleagues in the governance global practice, and they don't know the answer. So apparently someone is trying to put together a list, but things that are not counted don't count, right? So I'm wondering, what can you tell us about what looks from the outside like a lopsidedness between a commitment to create space for voice, but what about the capacity to respond? Where's the teeth?
Yes.
And you might want to refer to the bureaucracy lab. I don't know.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's a question that even us in the bank really are grappling with. But there are changes that are system-wide and observably so. And then there are changes that are atomized in terms of specific reform-minded public officials doing the right thing. So talking about government responsiveness, for example, it's very hard to talk about it in aggregate or system-wide. But if you look at specific examples where the World Bank has supported governments in responding to citizens, then there is a lot of that. We can, maybe that's the next kind of research frontier, we can do some research into what have been the good practices or even the not so good practices in government responsiveness to citizens. We talk a lot about the, closing the feedback loop. So for example, back to Uganda, the PPDA, it's a long name that I mentioned earlier, I won't repeat it, the Public Procurement Authority, they were having challenges with the government public procurement portal, which was not really designed for access by citizens or interested parties. It was designed to get information from the districts and so on. But how that was reformed was in no small part because the World Bank worked with the PPDA, supported, along with other development partners, obviously, the Africa Freedom of Information Center, rather, to actually bring their own expertise to strengthening the portal and to make it much more user-friendly. That's that's government responding to the needs of citizens to access information through the support that they get from development partners and from the World Bank. I can hear some. Okay, yeah, and in Malawi, I'll take an example of school instructional materials that have been getting lost, right? So the GPSA has helped the government of Malawi through civil society to respond to parents and teachers who were complaining that their instructional materials for children were getting lost, through the application of a social accountability system that helped to track the entire delivery chain from procurement to delivery at schools, and to help the Ministry of Education to develop the business processes to keep that system and to mainstream it right across government. So we can go on and find these examples, but I think that in the main, we have work to do to make this a default practice of government, to respond to the inputs and feedback that they receive from citizens. We actually have, as the GPSA, one of the comparative advantages that we talk about. I mentioned it in the context of Mongolia, that being in the World Bank actually helps us to nudge government towards a greater responsiveness, and so we've got emerging examples that show that we're doing that. Of course, there is also a political dimension to it, which is really about civic space and what governments are doing on that front, but maybe that's for another conversation.
Or maybe a little bit of a continuation of this one. Thank you so much for that. We are just a meta point. We're getting the experience of getting a lot of input and having a hard time responding to all of it. So there were some really great questions coming in. I'm sure we will not get to most of them, sadly. Warren, can you talk a little bit more about, there are a bunch of questions that have come up about this accountability ecosystem. What can be done to strengthen it, particularly in countries where there's political polarization, weak democratic institutions to start with, maybe even in conflict-affected states? Do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah. I'm not sure what to say. Accountability, the fiscal accountability ecosystem is a set of institutions. Ideally, you have all of them in one place and they interact with one another. What we don't know is, what are the preconditions in the accountability ecosystem? Which are the particular one or two institutions that need to be in place for that to work? And it's very hard to predict that. I can give you my guesses. I would think that the most important. I once got asked by someone from AusAid, we've got a bunch of money that we need to spend in newly democratizing countries. It's not a lot of money. We can make one investment. What should we do? And my answer to him, thinking about the South African situation, was build a fantastic independent finance department. That's an amazing investment. And I was thinking about that at the time because I'm South African and I've been watching South Africa at the time implode with President Zuma and the Guptas and the state capture story, etc. But I think the real lesson about that period in South Africa is that it didn't implode. And the reason why it didn't implode is because you had a terrific world-class Ministry of Finance, an independent Ministry of Finance, and you had citizens who had huge muscles, experienced muscles in organizing. So that was the first point, is a public finance department. I'm obviously biased towards having good engaged civic organizations. But the second point that I'll make about state capacity is supreme audit institutions. A lot of debate goes into legislatures, and legislatures are important as the keepers of the purse. But if you're looking for good independent institutions who have a stake in good financial accountability, bet on the accountants. And so I think that just those are some thoughts about the kinds of institutions that I think might be the bedrock of a system, even in relatively fragile and polarized environments.
Well, that could be a tweet for today, is for accountability, bet on the accountants. Jonathan, there was a methods, little bit of a substance and methods question that came up for you. Actually, many questions that are coming up for you. But it has to do with if you're imagining or starting to intensify engagement with actor-led, more systemic sort of approaches and interventions, what does that say about the methods that you can use to study those?
It's a real challenge because I mean, this came up in the earlier panel, some of the trade-offs, and I'll just mention one, which has to do with the aggregation of data that comes from monitoring, whether or not a program is working. And if the primary goal of gathering the data is to have a sufficiently large sample to be able to have statistically valid results, that implies a homogenization of what is going on across 500 villages. That answers the what works question from the point of view of someone sitting here in Washington or in the national capital. But if you are a change agent at the say provincial level or even at the national level, you are going to be very interested in the inherent geographical unevenness. Why are things working better in one district than in another? And where are the obstacles? What are the hot spots in terms of where corruption is concentrated versus the districts or municipalities where things are going well? And so we have a tension between an emphasis on demonstrating causality and just knowing what is going on. And so that's just one of the many trade-offs that we need to take into account.
Dean, did you want to add anything to that from your experience?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think I agree with all of that, and it was interesting, Warren, to hear how you're thinking about this challenge. I think we need to fundamentally shift our thinking to thinking not about evidence generation as evaluation as much as we need to start thinking about evidence generation and learning partnerships. And so for me, what that looks like is, as I mentioned earlier, I think doing this work is really hard. And so, you asked the question to Warren, what works? To me, where and to solve what problem is what I would want to start with. And then I think partnerships that involve explicating what is your theory of change for that broad-based coalition, and what are the assumptions that you are uncertain about within that theory of change as a group trying to affect change. And then using research, and there can be rigorous methods to sort of test those assumptions, right? Whether that's your formative research or even just, smaller scale. There's just so many assumptions embedded into people's models. And then the second thing I would say is I think a lot of times rigor means quantitative methods, and I just don't think that's where we should be. I think there's a lot of really interesting qualitative work that's out there, but we need to think more about sort of what are our theories of change and what would need to happen in order to get to success, and recognize that it's as much about eliminating and spotting failures quickly and changing course as it is about trying to get to something that works. And so just a very basic example of what that looks like, right? If you think that, a first order challenge is getting people to participate, right? And then from participation, effective action. A lot of things fail at the point of getting any kind of participation or voice. And so if we could be more systematic about and visible about when that is not happening and having feedback to then change course, we would be much, much better off. We focus way too much on, rigorously assessing the impact of the end of a very long causal chain when most things are failing much, much, much earlier on.
I see lots of people nodding their heads over that, clearly people with a lot of experience. Let's see. So I'm going to reinterpret this question. So there's a lot of decentralization, deconcentration going on. Does that present some real opportunities for that sort of work of citizen groups that are closer to the points where decisions are made? You want to take that, Jonathan?
I'll just tell a story that flips it a bit. I just came, like Jeff, I was on a plane last night from Jalisco, Mexico, and I was in dialogue with a CSO that works with mostly women in 5 of the poorer municipalities in the southern part of the state, and they work to encourage, provide technical support and training for women who want to become town councilors and community leaders. And one of the main challenges they're dealing with is drinking water. And in the decentralization process, the job of providing drinking water and water treatment belongs to the municipality. And the water is they're just drying up. And in this case, it's, according to the actors on the ground, not primarily climate change, although that is happening. It's because the National Water Agency gives away water concessions to agribusiness with no regard to the sustainability. There's basically no control. It's supposed to be just an inch-wide pipe. It's really 3 or 5 inches. It's unlimited amounts of water for the booming avocado and berry industry for export to the United States. And so in a meeting with the most open-minded government officials in the state, when the citizen activists were raising this issue, the response of the government official was, well, you just have to organize. Well, why would organizing at the municipal level help if the main problem is that a national agency is in bed with vested interests, not to mention the fact that if you stick your neck out on this issue, you are possibly putting your life in danger because of those vested interests may be laundering cartel money. In fact, they are, some of them, you know. And so decentralization can raise huge challenges if there's a misalignment between responsibility and authority, and that's a huge problem for citizens.
Really, really helpful. So I am now going to ignore all these incredibly amazing questions that have come in, including, and I just have to read some of them. So, what is good governance? How do you prove causality? How to avoid interest groups gaming systems that are supposed to enable voice. And boy, that water system sounds like Flint, Michigan. Okay, so I think that just means a lot of these themes are in fact universal or global in any case. I don't know what's happening on the moon. So what I'm going to invite in the remaining 10 minutes or so is for each of you to just speak for a minute or two about what do you want people to remember from this session? What, like the one takeaway from your experience and insights? Can I start with Eugene?
Gonna make Jeff go first to give me more time.
All right, I'm not sure I'm ready, but the thing that comes to mind, I'm very selfish about this, is to remember that civil society organizations and governments ultimately share the same vision of a country and government that works for citizens, that includes citizens, that listens to citizens, that engages citizens in addressing problems. And so the work that CSOs do needs to really find that synergy and alignment with what the government is doing. There is place, of course, for self-standing campaign-oriented pressure on government. Sometimes it's the only way they listen. But what we're calling collaborative social accountability within the GPSA is combining the idea that ultimately government still has to be accountable to citizens with the idea that there is scope for solving problems collaboratively. And so linking accountability with problem solving and collaboration is a very important theme for us, and I would like that kind of remembered as we get out of here, that collaboratively CSOs and governments, especially when we can mainstream civil society and citizens in sector reforms and public sector reforms of government, they can help the system itself, never mind actual delivery of services.
Yeah, maybe building on that, I think that theme has come up from a lot of comments, and I think my angle from where I sit is how to sort of advance the learning in those situations in which you have that collaboration and systematic approaches coming together, and that we fundamentally need to do evidence generation differently, larger at scale, bigger evidence generation strategies. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Warren.
Two related points. The first one that I wanted to make is that there's so much right and rightly so concern at the moment about the state of the world and the direction of governance in the world. And it's true that we're losing many battles, and many of the gains that we've made in open government over the last several years might be reversed. But at the same time, there is, as Ruth mentioned at the beginning, this incredible growth of anger and citizen action that's beginning to focus on public resources, on corruption, on all the issues that are at the root of the problem. And I guess what I'm hoping that people go home thinking about is the opportunity that's there, is how to harness this anger, how to harness this public attention to public services and public resources, the core issue in our democracy, and what can we do to bring to those citizens the right kind of tools and approaches and strategies and support to make sure that over time this moment of disaffected citizens gets translated into a moment of, I don't know, infected and engaged citizens. And within that moment is, I think, an opportunity for researchers and practitioners to think hard about the kinds of partnerships that will produce the evidence that's both rigorous and it's comparative. And it kind of stakes out this middle ground between the kinds of approaches that, the kinds of approaches that I talked to, the kind of qualitative approaches we had, and the RCT types of approaches, to a middle ground of approaches that really supports civic activism, helps them understand what works and what doesn't work, and what tools and tactics they can use.
I totally agree, although can I tweak your biological metaphor? I think going viral is better than getting infected. But I just want to say, as any community organizer would tell you, start with where people are at. Address the fear factor, be strategic, and it's a power thing.
Wow. Well, we have been given a lot of food for thought here, and I think particularly I will take away the idea of moving from intervention-focused, information-led, small-scale, tactical, transparency for its own sake type work to systemic, actor-led, long-term with embedded knowledge generation. All of those very hard things, which I think has been reinforced that we are, we have to challenge ourselves and pursue. And one very specific point that sticks in and that I've thought of during this conversation, and that others in the past have suggested, is that for those who are evaluators, if you think about generating findings, not so much for policymakers, but actually for citizens, like what would the recommendations look like if they were written for citizens? What should you do because this government program isn't working very well, or because the civil society organization who purports to represent your interests isn't actually getting traction, or is? So I think kind of holding in mind who the actual constituency is for much of the work we do is maybe a helpful thing. So with that, I want to thank this incredible panel and all of the people who asked questions. So round of applause for everybody.